So the book of Ruth. The book of Ruth begins with a woman named Naomi, her husband, and their two sons. The storyteller informs the reader there's a famine in Judah, so this family travels east to the land of Moab. And there Naomi's two sons find Moabite wives, Ruth and Orpah. But tragedy strikes. As if the famine wasn't bad enough, each of the men that we're introduced to, Naomi's husband and their two sons, they die, leaving Naomi alone with her two daughters-in-law. After some time, though, Naomi heard that the land of Judah wasn't experiencing famine anymore, so she returned west toward home. Now, her plan was to travel alone, so she encouraged Ruth and Orpah to stay behind. Orpah agreed, but Ruth wouldn't leave her mother-in-law's side, so she traveled to Judah with her. The book of Ruth begins with tragedy, despair, and hopelessness. Famine struck the land, the women are widowed due to the death of their spouses, and without children, they have no future hope. But here's what's so engaging about this short story. In every way, Naomi and Ruth are found wanting at the beginning of the story: famine, spouse, children. Their fortunes are reversed by the end of the narrative. And let me quickly point this out. Once the two women return to Judah, Ruth goes out into a field that belongs to this guy named Boaz. And she goes out to collect grain so she can eat. And in chapter 2, verse 14, we read that she ate until she was satisfied, and she had some left over. Now, later on, Ruth and this Boaz guy, they get married. And the story concludes with the two of them having a child. What began as tragedy ends in sweet celebration. The book of Ruth recounts God's providential hand of provision over the life of the two women in the midst of tragedy and everyday heartbreak. This story gives us an intimate look at God's care and nearness through the nitty-gritty of life. But more than this, the story of Ruth portrays a profound picture of God's commitment to corporate Israel. The narrator doesn't make it 2 sentences before telling the reader that this story takes place during the time of the Judges. The previous book's constant refrain rings in our ears as we open up the book of Ruth. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Up to this point, God multiplied the people of Israel as promised. He brought them safely into the promised land. Yet Israel's leaders and people walked away from their God. Where there should have been safety and shalom, injustice reigned because everyone did what was right in their own eyes. Now here's the connection between Ruth and the people of Israel. Spiritual famine was Israel's new norm. Israel walked away from her true husband, that's God, and she was left without a future hope. But Boaz's commitment to Ruth reminds us of God's faithfulness and commitment to redeem Israel. Like Boaz to Ruth, God gives himself to Israel, provides for her even amidst famine, and enables her to bear fruit, giving her a future hope. Though God never left his people, Israel walked away from God, giving her the appearance of a widow. Yet God doesn't leave or forsake. He establishes his covenant through the dark days, and he stays true to his people and promises. And what's more, we see in this story a profound picture of what God has done redemptively through Jesus, where we are found wanting, spiritually famined, widowed, and without hope. Jesus comes through. Jesus gives more than bread to feed the hungry. He gives us himself and tells us, "I am the bread of life." The Apostle Paul clarifies the mystery of marriage. He says that it refers to Christ in the church. Jesus is our great bridegroom, a better Boaz. Ruth and her husband give birth to Obed, the grandfather of King David, and Israel's source of future hope. But Jesus stands as the greater king who brings God's kingdom to earth and solidifies heaven's rule and reign by conquering the grave. In doing so, he gives us a future hope. Take some time to reflect upon the book of Ruth. In it, we see God's nearness, even when Naomi is feeling bitter and without hope. Yet we also see God's faithfulness to his people and promises. Though Israel walked away from God and did what was right in their own eyes, God provides for them and gives them future hope. And as we think about the whole of Scripture, God has done this and exceedingly more in Jesus. He satisfies the hungry and weary. His commitment to his bride, the church, is unparalleled, and the kingdom he established through his sacrificial love gives us a future hope beyond compare. Together, reflect upon a few of the following questions.